Okay, everyone, welcome to Asian American Studies 20, Introduction to Asian American Studies. Now, before we delve into the specific issues and topics that we will explore in this course through the semester, what I want to do first, as our first lecture topic, is to have a more general discussion about race. Okay, race in general. And to be more specific, as a historical issue, but also, and especially so, a contemporary issue that, frankly speaking, divides many Americans today. Okay, so it's a divisive issue, and this first lecture of the course is a sort of mini lecture or introductory lecture regarding some general observations and reflections on the centrality of race in contemporary American life. Now, I'm sure you're aware of this, and this is true especially in the last decade, race has definitely moved front and center in social and political discussion and discourse today. Um, Largely spurred by, George Floyd's murder, but of course he's not the only one. Police brutality and murder of unarmed especially males, but of course women as well. Um, we're familiar with the Black Lives Matters movement, right, as this important civil rights institution in contemporary life. And indeed, this course itself is an ethnic studies course, and as I'm sure you're aware, it is now a prerequisite in order to graduate from, say CSU, California State Universities, and indeed it's being introduced in a year or two in public high schools in California and other states as well. Now, it's important to note that some regions, some areas in America do not agree with this. Okay, the introduction of the study of race. Okay, which is why I pose the question here on the slide, why study race, right? Well, some Americans, like I said, do not want to study race as a topic. You may be aware of the controversy, for example, of critical race theory, right? And the critics of quote unquote critical race theory, basically, in the widest sense, the word critical race theory is teaching, the plight of ethnic minorities in curriculum, right? In the broadest sense of the word. Now, the critics of this approach are very vocal in their opposition and their condemnation of teaching race in the classroom, introducing this. Why? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but one reason that's commonly put forth is that when you do this, it divides us rather than unites us. And by the way, that same sort of sentiment is thrust towards BLM, Black Lives Matter. Some paint it in a negative light that, divides us rather than unites us, right? In fact, some more stringent critics say they're domestic terrorists, right? Rather than this respectable civil rights group. In any case, like I said, this is a class in ethnic studies. It will put race front and center. And I'm glad you're enrolled in this class to learn about at least one ethno-racial group in America today, Asian Americans. Of course, there are other subdisciplines in ethnic studies, African American studies, Native American studies, so forth. But here we'll be looking at Asian Americans, their histories, their struggles, their achievements, contributions to U.S. society, activism, and so forth. Okay. Now, I have to say this, though, that it's important to note that race has always been a hot button issue, so to speak. It's always been explosive. Some people think it just rose to the fore, in the last few years, and we had relative, peaceful relations in racial terms since Martin Luther King and so forth. Well, that's not exactly true, okay, historically speaking. And if you didn't know this, then you will likely realize it by the end of this course. Okay, so again, this course will obviously centralize race and ethnicity as its focal point. So, what I want to do before we discuss some more complex issues is to ask some very basic questions, such as what is race? What is ethnicity? What is the distinction between the two? Okay, these are very basic foundational questions. And what I'll do when we discuss this is, connect them to these contemporary ideas about race as seen from different perspectives and different angles of vision. Now, here in the slide, we see the distinction. And before you look over this, I want to emphasize here that, when it comes to categorizing people, okay, and that's what race is a form of classification and categorizing people based on physical attributes, namely skin color. But in a general sense, when you want to categorize different people, there are different ways to do that. And in our society, race has been the primary way to categorize different groups. That's not necessarily true with other countries and their histories. So what I want to emphasize here is that the primacy or the priority ascribed upon race is kind of arbitrary. Depends on the society, right? Of course, there are different ways to classify people. You could do it on other physical features aside from skin color. You could do it on height. You could separate people according to weight, eye color, right? You can even separate them according to other things like, socioeconomic status, right? Social class. Well, you can even do it, separate people based on, I don't know, zodiac signs, right? There's different ways to differentiate and form classifications or classes, excuse me, when it comes to different groups. But of course, race deals with the color of skin. Okay. Now, in past societies, as I just mentioned, race was not the primary way to categorize. It's only been in the last, I would say, 5 centuries that race has, number one, when race was invented, and we'll talk about that, okay, the creation and invention of race, and then how it moved front and center, to use my term here, as a primary way to categorize people. Okay, now we can go to the slide here. And it says here physical features, like I mentioned, especially emphasizing skin color. So you have, blacks, you have whites, you have people with red skin, quote unquote, Native Americans, right? Yellow skin, Asians, right? Brown skin, a variety of groups, right? Okay, and that's obviously a physical way, right? We may even use the word biological, right? It's connected to um, physical features. Now, here's what's important. What began or originated as physical distinctions, as a way to separate people or classify them, evolved to include non-physical traits. Okay, in other words, you begin with, let's say, separating or categorizing black skin versus white skin, right? And then eventually, what happens is that non physical features or traits or aspects or characteristics become imposed upon these certain groups. Okay, so what do we mean by non physical features or attributes? Well, think, for example, of intelligence level or morality, right? For example, it was commonly believed that persons of black skin were less intelligent, inherently less intelligent than people with white skin. It was also felt that persons with black skin were inherently, quote, primitive, right? And even had less morality, right, than persons with white skin. Now, obviously, we are talking about non-physical characteristics, like I said. And what happens, if you look at the slide, is these ideas, these constructions that has nothing to do with physical distinctions, okay, are usually involved in relations of power. And that's what I mean by this idea of dominant groups here, okay? In our history, it just so happens that white-skinned groups were the primary dominant group, right? And the minority subordinate group were persons of black skin. So because they are powerful, they ascribe these characteristics upon the subordinate group, right? This, again, these ideas that, oh, they're just naturally inferior, that they're immoral, that they lack intelligence. Some of the more egregious ideas or things like, oh, they're closer to the beast rather than to human beings, right? Now, I want to introduce a term here that's not on the slide, and it's something we'll discuss later, but that's the idea of essentialism. Okay, essentialism is when a group imposes, excuse me, or ascribes these ideas, such as, less intelligence or lack of morality, okay, upon another group. Okay, when you think about the term essentialism, the root of that term is essence. Okay, by the way, how do you spell that in case you don't know? ESSENTIALISM, essentialism. Okay. Now, what happens is when you think about essence, the term, you're thinking about this quality or characteristic that is supposedly possessed or shared by all entities within that group. Okay, that's their essence. And it could be a living group or it could be non-living, like water. It's not a living thing, right? So it's not a living entity. But what is the essence of water? H2O, right? So it's something that unchanges, permanent quality of all people. So what happens is that way of thinking spills over to race. You see what I mean? That all people supposedly have this characteristic, a characteristic shared by all members within that group. Okay, when you do that act, you are essentializing that group. Okay. All right, now this is opposed to ethnicity. Ethnicity sure begins with skin color, like I said, but instead of non-physical characteristics, you start talking about culture, right? A presumed common ancestry, common history, a way of life. And here's what's important. As opposed to it being imposed by a dominant group upon the subordinate group, ethnicity is self-defined. It is self-proclaimed, okay, by members within that group. Therefore, there's a sense of pride, a feeling of connection rather than, oppression. It's more celebratory, as the slide says. So today we tend to refer to ethnicity over race, right? We we still use the word race, okay, but we kind of use the two terms interchangeably, even though they're not exactly interchangeable. The starting point is, okay, maybe it begins with skin color, but ethnicity is more, like I said, self-defined, right? It's not externally imposed upon the subordinate group, okay? But we still use race. In fact, much of our contemporary language today, we still use the language of race being biological. When you use the term, for example, blood, right? Spanish blood, German blood, American blood. We know there's no such thing as American blood or German blood, right? There's only 4 types of blood, right? But we tend to forget that and we use that terminology. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide.